A suspicious explosion and the apprehension of a spy lead to Captain Picard becoming the target of a witch hunt aboard the Enterprise for the last time. Picard isn't a witch. He was playing a witch as a favor to Beverly in her gender-swapped production of Macbeth. And he was only doing that because Barclay dropped out after throwing up at final dress. You see, there are perfectly innocent explanations for all of this. This is a review of the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, The Drumhead. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know who the traitors are, be warned. Spoilers beyond this point. Wow, another 30-plus-year-old episode of Star Trek that still feels painfully relevant to our present situation. There are just so many of these, which is good for Star Trek. Just maybe not so good for us. As the episode begins, Riker and Troi are questioning a Klingon exchange officer who is suspected of espionage and sabotage, with Worf standing by just in case there's any trouble. This Klingon guy, Jadan, was recorded accessing ship schematics in the computer, schematics which, according to Starfleet intelligence, were obtained by the Romulans soon after. Jadan's like, I don't know, I just like looking at blueprints for important systems on starships. Is that a crime? No, and sometimes I like secretly passing those blueprints along to enemies of the Federation. Is that a crime? Yes. Oh, that is. Okay, sorry, I'll know for next time. Shortly after the Romulans got their hands on the plans, the Enterprise's warp drive was disabled by an explosion. Jadan insists he knows nothing about that, but Riker and Troi aren't convinced. Jadan knows he's cooked, so as Worf is escorting him back to his quarters, he says, "Hey, Worf, I know your family name has been dishonored because everyone thinks your father collaborated with the Romulans. I have friends back on the homeworld who could help you out with that if you looked the other way while I stole a shuttlecraft and got my ass out of here." Worf's like, "Let me think about it," and then punches him in the face. So that's a no. The revealing of a spy, the theft of the ship's schematics, and the explosion in engineering all point to some potentially serious problems aboard the Enterprise, so Starfleet sends in a special investigator to get to the bottom of it. This lady, retired Admiral Nora Sati. She arrives with her personal staff and gets right to business, inspecting the damaged warp drive, having tea with Picard, listening as Worf describes how Jadan used a modified syringe to translate the information he stole into protein sequences so it could be smuggled off the ship in someone's bloodstream. Sati is really impressed by that. After Worf leaves, she turns excitedly to Picard and says, "I like that, Lieutenant Lumpyhead." Worf confronts Jadan with the spy syringe, and Jadan admits to stealing the schematics and passing them to the Romulans, but he still insists he had nothing to do with the explosion that disabled the warp drive. Sati and her right-hand man, Sabin, are concerned that if Jadan didn't cause the explosion, someone else on board did. Picard and Sati meet later in her quarters, and Picard says, "If there is a conspiracy aboard my ship, I'm just glad you're here to help us root it out." Picard tells Sati that he's a big admirer of her father, who was a big-shot judge whose rulings were required reading in school. Sati says, "Oh, yes, my father was the best. You know, he used to pose questions to my brothers and me at the dinner table and force us to sit there and debate each other back and forth while he timed us with a stopwatch until he was satisfied." Picard's like, "Mandatory debate club at dinner every night. Your dad sounds like such a great guy." The investigation into the possible conspiracy kicks into a higher gear. They question Dr. Crusher about the regular injections Jadan received as treatment for a condition he has. That's the reason, ostensibly, he had that spy syringe. Sati says, "Dr. Crusher, did you give him those injections?" And Crusher's like, "No, I have a small army of moderately skilled lackeys who handle the grunt work." So, one of those moderately skilled lackeys comes in for questioning. Crewman Simon Tarsus. He's a quarter Vulcan, you know. That's why his ears look like that. Vulcan, I says. That's what's on his Starfleet application, and that's the truth. Tarsus answers some questions about his association with Jadan. He seems nervous. After he leaves, Sabin, who is Betazoid, says that he can sense Tarsus is hiding a big dark secret. Maybe Tarsus was conspiring with Jadan. He could be the saboteur. Picard is uncomfortable placing Tarsus under suspicion without hard evidence, but Sati insists on continuing to investigate him. Then Geordi and Data call Picard and Sati back to engineering for some important news. After carefully examining the warp core, they've concluded that the explosion was caused by undetected defects in the metal casing. In other words, the explosion wasn't an act of sabotage, it was an accident. Sati and Sabin aren't convinced. Oh, sure, maybe there was no sabotage, but there's still Jadan. He was definitely a spy, and he couldn't have been working alone. Maybe that's what crewman Tarsus is hiding. They were Confederates. Picard objects to this line of investigation and urges Sati and Sabin and Warf, who has joined the team, to remember that Tarsus is innocent. There is no evidence suggesting that he's committed any crime. The next day, the questioning of crewman Tarsus continues, this time in a public hearing. Picard doesn't like this either, but Sati insists it's for the best. Picard says, "Okay, but crewman Tarsus, for your own protection, I've assigned you counsel for this hearing. Commander Riker." Tarsus is like, "Thanks, but can I have an actual lawyer? Also, won't Riker be too distracted to represent me since he's also directing this episode?" After some aggressive questioning, Sabin reveals that he knows the big secret Tarsus has been hiding. Tarsus is not a quarter Vulcan, he's a quarter Romulan. He lied on his application to Starfleet. On advice from William T. Riker, Esquire, Tarsus invokes his right against self-incrimination and refuses to answer the question. Following the hearing, Picard finds Worf, who is dispatching his own small army of moderately skilled lackeys to dig up more dirt on Tarsus, and says, "What are we becoming, Lieutenant Lumpyhead?" This investigation is becoming like an ancient Drumhead trial, where officers would dispense swift, merciless judgments against the accused right there on the battlefield with no chances for appeal. Worf's like, "Sounds pretty great." But Picard says, well, it's not. Suspects aren't automatically guilty just because they've been accused. There needs to be evidence. People have rights that need to be protected. This whole thing is bullshit, and I'm stopping it right now. Later, in a private meeting with a sympathetic Captain Picard, Tarsus admits it. He lied on his application to Starfleet. Because of that lie, his career in Starfleet is over. Picard goes to Sati and tells her to abandon her investigation, but she refuses. In fact, the investigation is going to be expanded, and Starfleet Command will be directly involved. Admiral Henry from Starfleet Security is arriving to attend the upcoming hearings. And the star witness at the next hearing will be none other than Captain Picard himself, who is subpoenaed right there on the bridge in front of everyone while he just sits there in his chair like a chump. Picard moves from one chump chair to another as he takes his seat on the witness stand. Before Sati begins her questioning, Picard says, "I believe Federation law affords me the right to make a big speech." And then he makes his big speech, reviewing what's happened in this investigation so far. They found a spy who will stand trial for his crime, and that's about it. There have been suspicions directed toward crewman Tarsus, but no evidence of any actual wrongdoing on his part. No wrongdoing, that is, except for having a Romulan grandfather. Have we become so cowardly that we must extinguish a man because he carries the blood of a current enemy? Picard asks. "Admiral, I implore you, do not continue with this proceeding. End it now." Sati's like, no, and she dives right into her questioning of Picard. She mentions all the times he's broken the Prime Directive, and the time the Enterprise transported a Vulcan ambassador who turned out to be a Romulan spy, and the time Picard was assimilated by the Borg and oversaw the destruction of 39 Starfleet ships and the deaths of 11,000 people. Sati says, "I question your actions, Captain. I question your choices. I question your loyalty. You know what I don't question? The fact that you suck." Picard's like, "Give me a second to establish a meme template before I respond to that." You know, I'm reminded of a quote I've known since my school days, something about how the denial of freedom to one person is an injury to all people. I forget who said that. Was it? Oh, that's right. I remember who said it. Admiral Sati, your dad. Sati jumps up like, how dare you, traitor! You keep my father's name out of your mouth. You don't talk about my father. I'll kill you, dude. I'll fucking kill you. At this point, Admiral Henry is like, well, I need to go see about a thing. So I'll just watch this when it airs to see how it turns out because I've got to be someplace else now. Sabin says maybe we should adjourn at this point, and everybody files out until Sati is left sitting alone in the room. Later, Warf comes up to Picard in the observation lounge to tell him that Admiral Henry has ordered an end to all the hearings, and Sati has left the Enterprise. Picard says, you know, it's funny. You think witch hunts are ancient history until suddenly one starts happening right in front of you. Worf says, yeah, about that. Sorry for, going all Inquisitor there for a minute. Picard's like, nah, don't be so hard on yourself. Villains who disguise themselves as heroes can be tough to spot. People like her will always be with us, waiting for the opportunity to spread fear in the name of righteousness. We just have to remain vigilant. That, lumpy head, is the price we pay for our freedom. The end! The Drumhead, like The Measure of a Man, which I reviewed in the previous video of this series, is one of the defining episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, and one of the best episodes ever produced of any Star Trek series. It is, like I said at the beginning, sadly, very relevant to the world in which we live today, and perhaps most importantly, being an episode of a TV series and all, it's a well-made and very effective piece of drama. What I noticed about the Drumhead as I watched it this time is how subtle the transition from legitimate investigation to paranoia-driven persecution is. When the episode begins, there are actual causes for concern, a real crime and a real criminal that demand action. Jadan is a spy. He has passed on sensitive information to a hostile nation. Admiral Sati arrives with very reasonable expectations that Jadan's espionage and the explosion that damaged the warp drive are related and connected to larger, more dangerous criminal activities. Picard is totally on board at this point, happy and grateful to have Sati's help. That mood lasts until Geordi and Data report that the explosion wasn't sabotage, but merely an accident. From that point on, things begin to turn. The crime that was driving the investigation turns out to not have been a crime at all. Yes, Jadan is guilty of a crime, but he's been found out and arrested. It was the warp core explosion that seemed to indicate a broader conspiracy. Without that, there's no concrete reason to continue the investigation. But Sati and her team not only continue, they expand. The explosion wasn't a crime? Well, then the conspirators on board must be planning something else. They no longer have a reason to suspect conspirators, but they've already decided that there must be some. So they continue acting on that now baseless assumption. And by the time Picard realizes what's happening, the wheels are moving too fast to be stopped. Not only is this the stuff of great drama, and the script for this episode by Jerry Taylor is an excellent, masterfully paced bit of work, it's also an accurate depiction of how conspiracy theories form and take root, and of how initially reasonable suspicions can mutate into self-propagating obsessions. There's a moment where Worf says to Captain Picard, "Captain, the Federation does have enemies. We must seek them out." And you know what? He's right. The heroes of Star Trek, like us, do not live in a perfect world. There are opposing forces out there. Criminals, terrorists, hostile nations whose interests conflict with our own. It would be foolish to deny that. It would be foolish to not protect ourselves and our interests against those threats. But as we do that, it's just as important to remember that we should only be reacting to actual, verifiable threats. Somebody somewhere is probably doing something bad is not a valid justification for endless, overbearing investigations and police actions, nor is assuming that a crime has taken place before there's any legitimate reason to think so. One of my consistent criticisms of how Star Trek has historically handled political and social commentary is that it tends to present the problems it depicts as belonging to other people. Oh, the people on that planet are so racist. That alien race over there is so warlike. It's a them problem instead of an us problem. The franchise has gotten better at this over the years, and even when it was still a consistent issue, there were exceptions. I find the Drumhead to be such an exception for the way it depicts Sati's witch hunt as taking hold under Picard's nose and drawing in Worf as an active participant. Picard starts to pick up on the wrongness of what Sati is doing, but he's slow to respond at first. He tries a respectful approach. He tries to reason with her. He seems to assume that if he just reminds everyone of the law, they'll all agree with him and rein themselves in. He treats everyone involved as though they are reasonable, good faith actors. That's a mistake. When you step back to give dangerous people the opportunity to do the right thing, you're just making it easier for them to inflict more damage while continuing to do the wrong thing. Picard figures that out before it's too late. Good for him. As for Worf, this isn't a Worf episode per se, but it's one of my favorite Worf stories nonetheless, because it shows the limitations and liabilities of Worf's simplistic worldview. Worf is essentially a cop. His job is to enforce the law. In the Drumhead, he becomes so preoccupied with enforcing the law that he never stops to ask whether the law is being properly applied in this case. He feels a personal involvement due to Jadan being a fellow Klingon, and also Jadan attempting to manipulate Worf into helping him by bringing up Worf's wrongfully dishonored father. He's easily seduced by the confidence that Sati and Sabin show in him, and their encouragement to continue his pursuit of the truth about crewman Tarsus. The investigation ceases to be about finding the truth and becomes a crusade to get somebody, anybody, for doing something. Worf is one of the good guys. That's the point. He's still one of the good guys at the end of the episode when he realizes that he's been misled and expresses dismay at his behavior to Captain Picard. We know Worf. He can be a little thick-headed sometimes, but he's an honest and noble person. If someone like him can be drawn under the influence of someone like Admiral Sati, so could any of us. The Drumhead also reminds us of the importance of legal rights that some of us, especially we Americans in our tough-on-crime zeal, downplay, overlook, or even rail against. There's a certain kind of person, usually someone with right-wing political beliefs, but not always, who views rights such as those defined in the U.S. Constitution's 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments with disdain. The right to refuse a search without a warrant, the right to refuse to cooperate with police, the right to due process and legal representation. These are seen as refuges for criminals, obstacles to justice that make it easier for bad people to get away with doing bad things. And sometimes that happens. But the Drumhead shows us why those rights are still important, are still essential to a free society. Because even though they sometimes make it more challenging to punish criminals, they also make it more difficult to wrongfully punish the innocent. Crewman Simon Tarsus is not guilty of anything other than falsifying his application to Starfleet, but he finds himself the target of an aggressive investigation, accused of far more serious offenses: espionage, sabotage, treason. If he didn't have those guaranteed legal rights, if the law did not make it clear that being accused of a crime was not the same thing as being found guilty of that crime, he would be powerless against the steamroller Sati drives his way. One more very smart and very crucial point this episode makes, and it also involves crewman Tarsus and Worf. Racism and xenophobia are the essential fuels that power Sati's witch hunt. Tarsus is at first suspected because of his proximity to Jadan, but when it's discovered that he is not part Vulcan, but instead part Romulan, the suspicions directed against him are greatly amplified. Romulan? Jadan was working with the Romulans. Tarsus is Romulan. He must be in on it too. You might say, well, okay, but let's not forget that Tarsus did lie on his Starfleet application. He admits it. Sure, the way he's treated during Sati's investigation isn't fair, but that never would have happened if he'd only told the truth. That's one way to look at it. I'd rather take a different view and ask the question, why did he feel he needed to lie about his heritage in order to join Starfleet? Could it be that prejudice against Romulans, all Romulans, regardless of who they are as individuals or what role, if any, they play in their government, is so common in the Federation that Tarsus assumed his application would be denied if he told the truth? Maybe if the Federation were more like the tolerant and enlightened society it claims to be, Tarsus wouldn't have felt the need to lie. As for Worf, it's no random choice by the writer to show us Worf being welcomed aboard Sati's team when his work is producing results they like, only to be viciously and publicly rejected by Sabin the moment he steps out of line. Worf stands up to defend Captain Picard during Sati's questioning, and Sabin responds by saying, "Captain Picard, don't you think it's poor judgment to have a chief of security whose father was a Romulan collaborator?" Worf goes from a valuable officer to the son of a traitor who is probably a traitor himself, and all it takes is a second. To Worf, and people who find themselves in a situation similar to Worf's in this episode, the message from Sati and all the Satis of the world is clear. You're one of them. We'll tolerate you while you're useful to us, and not one moment longer. You'll never be one of us. It's a great episode. Well acted. The regulars, particularly Patrick Stewart and Michael Dorn, do solid work, and Gene Simmons is fantastic as Admiral Sati. Some fantastic character beats, a superbly told story with lots of very pertinent things to say, and on top of all that, it's the third episode of TNG directed by Jonathan Frakes, who, in addition to playing Commander Riker, would go on to become one of the most reliable directors in the entire Star Trek franchise, ultimately helming a total of 8 TNG episodes, 3 Deep Space Nine episodes, 3 Voyager episodes, and the films Star Trek First Contact and Star Trek Insurrection before returning to the franchise in the current era, and also directing 8 episodes of Discovery, 6 episodes of the Picard series, and 2 episodes of Strange New Worlds, including one from the upcoming 3rd season with more to come in the future, I'm sure. There are 1 or 2 moments in the Drumhead that feel a little awkward, visually speaking, that perhaps testify to Frakes' inexperience at this point in his directorial career. I've always found this cut to a close-up of Beverly as she responds to a question from Sati during the interrogation of Tarsus to be a bit jarring. But for the most part, Frakes directs the episode beautifully. I love the way he uses this crane shot to show Picard after he's been summoned to testify before the hearing. The camera lowers down like the heavy consequences that have just been dropped onto Picard's shoulders. It's very nicely done. This is the kind of episode Star Trek was created to make. It's dramatic, it's character-driven, and it has something important to say about us and our world. Right now, our world is being overrun by exactly the sort of unwarranted suspicion and unjust persecution that afflicts the Enterprise in this episode. When Sabin says to Picard, "We're only investigating Tarsus so that we can establish his innocence," that should sound uncomfortably familiar to us, because we hear echoes of that self-serving lie in the news every day. We're only after the immigrants who came here illegally. We'll only deport the violent ones. We just want to protect the children. On and on and on. What does Picard call it? Spreading fear in the name of righteousness. That's why his final words to Worf are words we so need to hear and remember. Vigilance. That is the price we must continually pay. We have to stay vigilant, most of all against our own vulnerability. Because as we're seeing every day in real time, the most dangerous thing about spreading fear in the name of righteousness is it works. Those are my thoughts on the Drumhead. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would if you can afford it, You can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me next time as this batch of reviews of Courtroom episodes continues. There are still a couple of Courtroom episodes from TNG to talk about, but those will have to wait for another batch of Courtroom episode reviews, and there will definitely be another one at some point, because this batch is moving on to Deep Space Nine, which also produced a few Courtroom episodes. The first of those I'm going to look at comes from Deep Space Nine's first season, and it's called Dax. That's next time. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.